Thank you, Jeff, for those inspiring comments. I'm honored to present our next keynote speaker, Isabelle Falque-Pierrotin. Isabelle Falque-Pierrotin has, for the past 7 years, I believe, led the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, which is one of the largest, most sophisticated, and most effective data protection authorities in the world. Like its name suggests, it has both informatique and liberté. And I think the way that Isabelle has led this institution really combines both tech savviness and knowledge. For example, Gwenda Legrand, who is sitting here with her, is the chief technologist for the CNIL. Just having that role is something which is novel and innovative in data protection authorities and has really led the way to others around the world. I think actually the CNIL had one before the FTC, or maybe similar timing. But also bringing in the liberté, the human rights, the fundamental rights, the freedoms that are really at the basic of the European data protection framework and of any privacy framework around the world. For the past 4 or 5 years, Isabelle Falque-Pierrotin chaired the Article 29 Working Party, which is also known now as the European Data Protection Board. It was a period of just immense achievement, really. I mean, you know, it blows my head to think about navigating an institution that has 28 data protection authorities from the UK and Ireland and France and Germany and Spain, and also Lithuania and Hungary and Greece. And, you know, just think about navigating this vehicle. And it was an incredibly fruitful period with many, many opinions and guidelines at really a volume and velocity that dwarfed anything that was done before. So I congratulate Isabelle for those achievements, and we are always grateful for your participation at our events, and are really honored to have you here in Israel. Thank you. And Jules will operate.
Do you mind if I sit here? Because I can't put my papers here.
Please, hopefully we'll make it a little more of a conversation, but for sure you have some opening thoughts.
Maybe I can put here. Okay. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Jules and Omer to have organized such an interesting meeting, an interesting debate, and thank you to the chair of Velita to be here and to have had these nice words. So my mandate today is a bit delicate. First, I'm after Jeff, which is difficult. And second, my mandate is to issue a speech on lessons from Paris and Brussels, regulating a data economy. So I'm not going to give you any lessons from Paris or Brussels, as if we were in Europe capturing the truth of the regulation. But I can certainly share some convictions, reflections with you that I drew from my experience as CNIL chair, in fact, indeed since 2011, and as chair of the Working Party 29 in the last 4 years, in the years in which we prepared the GDPR. And I will try to have these reflections and convictions rather cold-blooded, I would say, to prevent some kind of moral panic. So the first conviction that I draw from my experience is that we need to change our approach to data protection, in fact. and change it into a real data governance. Why? Why? Because the status of the data has changed. It has been said by the previous speakers. It is now central, the data, transversal, strategic in many ways. It's said to be the oil of the digital economy, the currency, the lever for innovation, but also possibility through the data for individuals to live many lives, to have public figures. And given these new realities, of course, data protection has to change. Of course, it is still essential because individuals, consumers, investors in all the countries in the world express their will to have more control on their data and more security. But I believe that data protection now is a too narrow scope for an effective regulation. The idea then is to build a real data governance architecture. What does it mean? It means to define the relationships and the balance of powers that is needed now among the actors as regard the use of data in order to have a regulation that is both effective but also trusted. Of course, all actors are concerned, business and individuals, private society, but also regulators. The GDPR is an answer to that, to this need of a data governance architecture. It is proposing a complete and new data governance architecture. Its first idea, of course, is to modernize the European framework, having more flexibility with the use of data, getting rid of useless formalities, but at the same time put a key element as a starting point. Personal data are not assets like any others. They relate to individuals empowered with specific new rights, renewed or reinforced. So there is a new governance in the idea of the GDPR that is to rebalance the relationship between end users and private companies and put more powers in the hands of individuals. But there is also a new governance in the way the relationship between the regulators and the stakeholders is organized, and new internal governance within the companies. The spirit of the GDPR is that the approach towards data protection is now transversal, global, encompassing the whole data cycle with our economy and organizations. No longer a one-shop issue or a one-shop relationship with the regulator, but a continued dialogue around the accountability tools. New tools are available for data controllers to comply, enshrining in the principle of accountability. And the key understanding is that data protection is an ongoing issue that can no longer be confined to the legal department. It has to be integrated throughout companies and organizations' processes and strategy. There is also another aspect of this new governance model, that is the new governance in between the DPA. Because now we have cooperation relationship that is different than in the past, and the DPB that was mentioned by Omer is really the place where the 28 European regulators can interact and co-decide together. I will not say more. You see, as a whole, there is a new approach to data between all the players with the idea to set a clear governance model between them. And so it is also a very big cultural change as well as an operational change. Conviction number 2. Personal data and privacy can be good for economy and for business, and even for security. Often, people say that data protection is a constraint. It's an interesting constraint, but without any operational benefit. And with the GDPR, we hear again this song. Many people saying that the compliance efforts are very costly, they need huge investment in legal, IT, HR, etc. Of course, it is partly true. there are necessary efforts to comply. And in fact, there is also around the GDPR some kind of a catch-up effect from the company as regards the EU directive. Maybe the EU directive was not so well respected. But with the GDPR, Europeans are betting on one thing. Data protection and privacy can be good for business and change market conditions. Why? Because there are growing expectations from the consumers and the markets on this issue. Since the Snowden revelations in 2013, the confidence crisis in the digital society has developed, and people are clearly expressing demands for more guarantees and control on their data. I can give you a few examples. In December 2016, the European Commission carried out a Eurobarometer poll on the privacy electronic communication. More than 72% say it is very important that the confidentiality of their emails and online instant messaging is guaranteed. 56% said it's very important that tools for monitoring their activities online can only be used with their permission. There is actually, around the GDPR, a real appetite for information regarding data protection and privacy. Already in 2017, we could feel at the CNIL level a GDPR effect with a 60% increase of our visit in our website compared to 2016, and the trend is continuing. The French search engine, Quant, which made privacy as its core business argument, is in constant growth. The number of search requests it dealt went from 2.6 billion in 2016 to 9.8 billion in 2017. Recent trends clearly indicate a growing interest in privacy. The use of ad blockers and VPN is on the rise in the US and elsewhere. Corporations have responded to the demand, and in August last year, Mozilla introduced Firefox Focus, a privacy mobile browser. And in September 2017, Apple added tracking preventions to its Safari browser. So we can see that there is a growing privacy demand from the public, from the consumers, and privacy is becoming more and more an integral part of the company's reputation. And we've seen after the Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the consequences for all these companies. So there is the renewed interest for privacy, and therefore we believe that data protection can be a competitive argument. EU represents a significant market for digital trade, and this situation could, in this regard, give the EU some kind of privacy leverage, all the more as the GDPR creates the first unified European data market with the same legislation all over Europe. Privacy protection is also good for business because privacy protection is the first level of data security. And this is less known, but data security is a growing concern all over the world. And of course, data protection ensures data security. It is the first level of data security. And for instance, in the inspection that CNIL is leading each year, more than, I would say, 80% of this inspection identify some kind of security risks. Here, GDPR takes a proactive stance with new obligations, encryption, notification of data breaches, new obligations for processors, privacy impact assessment. So clearly, data protection will contribute to cybersecurity and therefore contributes, I guess, to business improvements. Conviction number 3. We need, as regulators, to invent new tools and new approaches. In particular, because we have to deal with the word that has been pronounced previously by the speaker, we have to deal with the scale of the problem. In fact, digital environment is complex, and complexity calls for innovation, also in regulation and policy making. I believe that effective solutions can be found through dialogue with all the stakeholders, and that the legal responses are to be elaborated in mixing several legal influences and traditions. For sure, there is a key lesson that we learned around the GDPR, is that the era of one-size-fits-all solution is over when it comes to regulation, and that we have to patch several solutions in order to have these efficient and accepted regulation. Excuse me, I'm just a bit lost in my paper. Policymakers and regulators need now to be much more innovative and flexible when designing the legal frameworks to be applied to the digital economy. So if we have to mix several legal influences, the GDPR is actually a good example of such a method. Hybridization of legal influence at the crossroad between different models and legal systems. Let me give you a few examples. Compliance, accountability, data protection officers, data breaches, notification, these have been imported from the American system. Privacy by design is important, is a Canadian-born notion. Asia had been at the forefront of certification models that are now integrated into the GDPR. So the GDPR already is a mixture of very different legal influences. Of course, the international conference is actually the relevant platform to work towards such an innovative regulation patching various legal influence. A reflection process is currently ongoing in order to redefine the conference's objective and common project. It can certainly be a place where we can aim at having different models, talking to each other, working towards the interoperability and convergence of different regulatory models. I said innovation through dialogue with different legal traditions. I said also dialogue with the stakeholders. And this is not, for regulators, I would say, a sort of communication trick. It is the only possibility for regulators to build regulatory tools rooted in reality. It is also key, this dialogue, to ensure a real implementation of regulation. In France, we've been very active on that side in the last 5 years. We have, for instance, negotiated compliance pacts with industry representatives, banks, insurance, car makers, in order to help them conduct their compliance efforts. Our intention is to transform these tools into sectorial referentials for the GDPR, because when you have such a high level of sanction with the GDPR, 4% of the annual revenue, what you want is to avoid the sanctions. So you turn to the regulators in order to have guidance. And I strongly believe that regulators must provide guidance of that kind. Last type of innovation, it is of course the necessary dialogue that different regulators must have together. And we can find inspiration from other regulatory fields, such as competition law or consumer law. And in France and also in Europe, we've started to dialogue in between regulators and to develop what we call in France some kind of inter-regulation. Lesson 4, we need to stay open and work for a global governance. Maybe it's a bit strange with the GDPR to say such thing, because of course GDPR is a strong signal, it's a strong political project. The Union is reaffirming its digital sovereignty while supporting the development of the digital economy. If others want to be inspired by this approach, fine. And the conversation around the GDPR all over the world is very positive and interesting. But there is no intention from the EU to impose a model worldwide. Our only intention is to make sure that on our territory, our law is respected by actors operating in Europe. This should not surprise anyone. It is usually the case. When you go abroad, you usually are bound to respect the foreign legislation in food security, in norms, etc. So the GDPR makes exactly the same, just for data. Nonetheless, even if we have a strong political and reinforced European identity, I believe that the future of regulation needs to be global. Therefore, we don't want Europe to be closed. We need to develop international bridges and cooperation tools. Before, we had some international discussions on international standards. We had these international standards agreed in Madrid almost 10 years ago. Maybe it was too early, but what is needed for sure now, it is international conversation and governance. Here again, the international conference aims at paving the way for a global governance model. As I said before, it launched, and it's the first time the conference is doing this, it launched its consultation process several months ago within its members in order to define its strategy and means for the future. Right now, we have more than 65, 70 members, regulators of the International Conference that have been directly consulted through the regional networks and that have expressed their needs for the future of this conference. Do we need a kind of international organization around data protection in order to tackle the future challenges? What should be the role of the regional networks? What kind of common principles can we agree on? As chair of the International Conference, I will propose with my Canadian colleague, that is co-rapporteur of the subject, several options for the next conference in Brussels in October. One of the most pressing challenges ahead of us is, of course, artificial intelligence and machine learning system. We are seeing multiple initiatives at government level, but also for multilateral organization in the field of artificial intelligence. And the International Conference is therefore working on a declaration through a working group, gathering a set of key principles to be applied in artificial intelligence system development. We're not talking here about a global regulation or a global standards, but about principles that should govern any framework to be applied in the field of AI and machine learning. And our goal is to trigger and contribute to a future global governance on artificial intelligence. So, these are the 4 lessons or 4 convictions I would like to share with you this morning. And again, I think the type of exchanges we're going to have today is very fruitful, and that all the regulators, in fact, are searching for good solution, for better solution, and patching input for various parts of the world. And I guess, you know, the exchanges of today go exactly into that direction. So thank you for the organizers again.
Since we're running late and you really covered many of the key issues, I'll ask perhaps just one question that I think many in this audience probably don't easily see. France has incorporated, obviously, the GDPR, but has also done some unique amendments and additions. Maybe you can share a little bit about France in particular addressed some issues around the right of explanation that the GDPR deals with in a limited way, and the new French law deals with a little bit extensively. And you mentioned Quant. There are some who are calling one particular amendment in the French law the Quant Amendment, but obviously it's about requiring privacy options, apps or third-party options to be available. Perhaps you could share just a little bit about that, because I think people are following GDPR, and the fact that there are some very important national implementations like this one is really critical.
Well, I want to say first that the idea of national legislation on top of GDPR is not to disharmonize the efforts that GDPR is conducting. So in France, we have been very keen and very cautious not to have too many initiatives in our law in order really to stick to the harmonization efforts of the GDPR. Still, we needed a law in order to bridge our regulatory infrastructure, in particular the powers of the French regulator, to the architecture of cooperation that is set by the GDPR. So we needed the law. Before answering to what you said, to ask, I just want to react to the previous example given on the New York Times, fearing closing is the possibility for European subscribers, or closing, sorry?
New York Times. LA.
Okay, LA Times, whatever. There has been some kind of misunderstanding about that. People saying, oh, I'm going to be caught by the GDPR because I have some kind of international service, and this service is potentially attracted or used by European individuals, so I'll be submitted to the GDPR. This is not true. Maybe it is a political decision, but it's not a legal decision. You are, as foreign actors, if you're not established in Europe, you are submitted to the GDPR if your intention is to target directly the European market, which means to operate deliberately and through various indicators on the European market. But if your offer of goods and services is roughly directed to the entire world, including Europe, but not particularly in Europe, you're not submitted to the GDPR. So there has been a kind of a panic, around this, and I want to make sure that this panic is not expanding.
The opinion of those who are making this decision is driven in large part by the view that they are monitoring at large scale the behavior of Europeans, because their business model is targeted advertising. So they have an option: turn off for the Europeans targeted ads, which means and many of them can't even do that because their model is targeted ads. And so they can either do some work to treat the Europeans more gracefully in line with GDPR, or block. Would you, with that framing, are they being, obviously it would be nicer if they accommodated, but if their choice is, today I don't have the interest or the time, block or allow, are they captured by the monitoring? That's their fear.
Yeah, the monitoring criteria is, you're right, a more delicate criteria. What I can say now is that we will publish at the DPB level some guidelines. It should have been prepared by July, but it took a little bit more time, so it will be published in September, and we will define really clearly under what conditions the criteria of targeting and the criteria of profiling somehow will apply to foreign companies not established in Europe. So you will see this more clearly in September.
Thank you. Please join. Yes.
Maybe just a follow-up question to that. So there is another potential model which is paid for subscription, for example, if you want to get content. And I just wanted to ask if the option that a publisher like, say, the LA Times presents to its readers is you can have the free content, ad-supported, we monitor, and you get targeted ads, or the alternative is that you pay for the service. Is that something that you see as acceptable?
Well, I don't think it makes any difference You know, because the question is not if the service is free or if you have to pay for the service. The question is if you are collecting and profiling European person. So it's the question. It doesn't. There is no consequences whether the service will be by subscription or if it's free.
If it's paid, you are not monitored. That's the idea. No cookies, but you have to pay.
Oh, if you are not monitored, but well, if it's the case, that's different. But if it really depends on the type of advertising that you would have in the pay service.
Please join me in thanking the CNIL president for her comments today.